I'd like to welcome everyone here and thank you for joining us. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Today's presentation is a real treat. Chris Dant has done this in past years, and we're just happy to have him repeat this program for us. Christopher Dant is a local writer and a photographer who previously worked with the great landscape photographer Ansel Adams in Carmel, California in the 1980s. Dant's work has been part of exhibits in California where he taught photography for the Ansel Adams Friends of Photography workshops. In 2016, his black and white landscape photographs were shown in a juried exhibit at the Southern Vermont Arts Center. And at GMALL, Christopher has given several talks about famous photographers. We're very happy to have you with us again, Christopher.
Thank you. Well, let me share my screen. Before I start, let me just say this one thing, because it's, you know, I've had the great honor, and I'm sure some of you have been able to see some of Ansel Adams' original prints in a museum or an exhibit, or perhaps somebody you knew that actually owned one. And I've seen, you know, probably something that nobody's seen. I've seen his prints in the darkroom as they were coming up out of the tray, and how beautiful they were. And it's unfortunate this computer screen can't really portray the sheer beauty of an Adams print, but it will approximate it. And I just wanted to mention that you know, we're having to do this over Zoom, and I understand that. But, you know, his original prints had a depth that almost looked three-dimensional. I remember looking at one 3 by 5 foot print, and it almost looks like it had a three-dimensional quality, like a silver metallic value, and it was so unbelievably gorgeous. I couldn't believe it. So I'm going to try to approximate that on the screen here with some high-resolution photographs, and hopefully you will enjoy those. So I'm very happy to give this talk again. It's given it 3 other times, and you know, I always feel a great honor to talk about this man, because he is such a great artist and a conservationist. So let me start by telling you something about him. He was born at the edge of the Pacific West in California, the child of a very domineering older mother who wouldn't pay attention to her son's dreams of wanting to become a photographer. And as a boy, his family was struck suddenly with great poverty and hardships. And the child became sickly, almost hyperactive. He was actually a hyperactive kid, and he never went beyond primary schooling. In his early life as a young man, he struggled to actualize his vision and craft of photography at a time when the country was in the great throes of a depression in the 1930s, and then later in the 1940s during a world war, when people couldn't even afford the basics of life, and at a time when photography was not even considered to be an art form. He struggled with defining the medium, inventing techniques and equipment to form his vision, but unfortunately, nobody bought his photographs, and he had remained financially insecure much of his life, and lived a very modest life until he was well within his 6th decade. But despite these personal hardships and those in the world around him and the time he lived in, he never lost sight of his craft, his vision, and his belief, and he pushed always forward, never giving up, never quitting. His whole life would be a journey, an exploration, a search for a meaning of order, for beauty and redemption, for contact with something larger, something more lasting, for community, for home. And compared with the vast landscape about him, he was very small, yet his camera and his eye connected us to that vastness, that wild landscape in a deep and almost a mystical way. For 70 years, he wandered the unoccupied spaces of the West, as they dwindled and shrank, trying to capture on film the majesty of the American continent and the sublime and humbling exaltation of wilderness. And more than any other artist of the 20th century, he transformed the meaning of wilderness and changed what people felt about their own land, about their own country. And by the time of his death, The man had received great honors and the attention of the entire country and of the world, and from several US presidents that few artists have ever received, and his photographic work and his conservation continue to make their considerable mark now, nearly 40 years after his death in 1984. So tonight, I'd like to tell you the story of Ansel, this remarkable man, Ansel Easton Adams. Many of you know him through his landscape photographs of the West, but he was quite literally the most influential and beloved photographic artist and conservationist, becoming really a national institution. I think if a country as limitless and spectacular as America could ever be said to pose for its own portrait, certainly the photographer behind the camera would have been Ansel Adams. The world is falling to pieces, and all that Ansel Adams photographs are rocks and trees. His work is an idealized wilderness that no longer exists. This was a stinging criticism of Ansel in the 1930s during the Great Depression when people were starving. It came from Henri Cartier-Bresson, the surrealistic French photographer of street people. And yet, the places that Ansel photographed are precisely those rocks and those trees, those wilderness and national parks that have been preserved for all time through his tireless work. It was through Ansel's foresight and his fortitude that so much of America today has been preserved for future generations. He would spend his life trying to capture on film the American continent and its sublime wilderness. His photographic images would become the symbols, the icons of wild America. And the journey that he took to get there, to achieve such notoriety and greatness, is held within his remarkable history. And my story is told through that history, but also through my own personal experiences with him and the work with other notable photographers who are very close to him, some of him as primary assistants later in his life. Ansel Adams was born in San Francisco in 1902 in the winter, and the only child of a once prosperous family on their way down in the world. And it was a time when the Western frontier had closed, a time when the country had to decide whether Western places should be preserved and valued, which greatly influenced his later life. When he was 12, he taught himself to play the piano, and he later took lessons, and playing the piano was his primary occupation. By 1920, when he was 18, being a concert pianist was his intended profession. The piano brought him a discipline and structure to an otherwise erratic youth with a domineering mother who never wanted him to be a photographer. And so he poured himself into the piano, and his careful and exacting musical training later profoundly affected his visual artistry. When he was 14, Ansel's father gave him two fateful gifts. One was a #1 box brownie camera, Kodak box brownie camera in its own leather case. It cost his father $1. And the second was a family trip to Yosemite Park. And so on June 16th of that year, the family set off for their 2-day journey from San Francisco to Yosemite, rumbling by train across the Central Valley, up through the foothills of the Sierras, on by open bus, even higher into the Sierras, following the Merced River deeper into the mountains until at length the river sharply angled. And as Adams wrote later, the splendor of Yosemite burst upon us. He later said, there was light everywhere. There were white waters, azaleas, cool caverns, tall oaks and pines. A new era has begun for me. From that day, my life has been colored and modulated by the great earth gesture of the Sierra Nevadas. And his first photographs were nothing more than snapshots, sort of blurry like this one, but they formed the visualization for his formidable later work. His friend Nancy Newhall later said he was endlessly trying to pour into that magic little box brownie camera his wonder and his ecstasy of everything about him. And he returned to San Francisco with a consuming desire to learn photography, and he later went to work for a photo finisher in San Francisco. And for the next 50 years, he would divide his time between San Francisco and Yosemite, the twin poles of his outgoing yet private personality, trying to capture on film the majesty of the American continent. From that first visit in 1916 until his death in 1984, Ansel Adams would visit Yosemite every year. In 1919, he joined the Sierra Club, and on one trip to Yosemite, he visited the best studio and met the best family who kept a piano in their parlor, and he would often use that for practice. There, he met a woman, their daughter, Virginia Best, who was studying to be a classical singer, and he fell hard. But through an on-again, off-again relationship, in 1928, they were married, and this is them at the Best Studios. He was 26 and she was 24. Like many artists, he was constantly absorbed in his work, and Virginia was as good a partner as he could have found. She had to deal with that. She wasn't there for the birth of his two children, Michael and Anne, and he was away for long stretches on assignments and in the mountains. And Virginia dealt with that well and stuck with him, encouraging his directions, and in some cases, even going on some of the trips with him. When Ansel had first visited Yosemite, it was only 2 years after the death of the great Scottish naturalist, John Muir. And Adams was captivated by this man who had fought for the preservation of the environment and founded the Sierra Club in 1892 when he established Yosemite as a national park. Adams had been referred to as the visual John Muir. Like John Muir's contemporary writings had the inspirational effect on many people on the appreciation for wilderness, Adams' photography had the same effect in modern times. In 1919, when he was 17, Ansel had his first serious contact with the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club was a really big deal back then, and it's still a big deal, but very much back then. When he became the custodian of the headquarters in National Park, and we see him here in what they call the Sermon on the Mount. This is a pretty famous photograph. Adams had a love affair with the grandeur of Yosemite for nearly 3/4 of a century. He was married there. His son Michael was born there. He was one of the originators of the famous Bracebridge dinners. I don't know if anybody have ever heard that, but they're really fabulous. I've never been to one. Christmas pageants at the Ahwahnee Hotel that dated from 1927. That now it's continuing this year into its 94th year. At this time, Adams came under the influence of a man named Albert Bender, who was a wealthy San Francisco patron of the arts. And this is Bender in the center with Ansel on the beard and Virginia on the right. And he set in motion after they met, right after they met, publications of Ansel's photographic work. His friendship, encouragement, and tactful financial support, he changed his life dramatically. His creative energies and abilities as a photographer began to blossom, and he began to have the confidence and wherewithal to pursue his dream. By 1929, with Bender's help, Adams realized that he was going to be more likely to prosper as a photographer than as a concert pianist. And in 1934, he was elected to the Sierra Club's board of directors and was established as both the artist of the Sierra Nevada and as a naturalist. Bender helped Adams publish his first portfolio of the High Sierras called The Parmelian Prints of the High Sierras. This was really a big deal in 1934 at the time of the Great Depression. Nobody had ever published anything like this. And this is actually a picture of one of them. That publication triggered the transformation of the journeyman concert pianist into an artist. He wrote to his wife shortly after this was published, "Virginia, my photographs have now reached the stage. I think they are truly worthy of the world's attention." And after a few weeks of this letter to Virginia, he returned to Yosemite with his wife and 2 friends. And on a brilliant Sunday afternoon in early April, the 4 of them hiked up on the western flank of the great granite face of Half Dome. A strenuous effort, and it was partly in snow, and they were slipping, and they didn't have any ropes. It was pretty dangerous. And he was carrying a 25-pound 8x10 view camera, 2 lenses, heavy wooden tripod, and several heavy glass plates in a big box that he made. And they didn't have negatives back then that big, so he made his own glass plates. And he walked out onto this place called the diving board, a small point of granite from which you can look straight right up into the sheer face of Half Dome. And there he made a photograph that would change his life. He had only had 2 unexposed glass plates remaining. And he set up the camera, carefully composed the image, and he put in the glass plate. And he clicked the shutter. And he suddenly thought, the picture I just took when I printed isn't going to communicate what I'm feeling as I'm standing here. What I feel is far more dramatic. This is one of the original photographs that he took, the first one. He visualized this mountain in great contrast to the dark rock and in the deep sky with the bright snow to make a sense of drama and grandeur, but his original exposure was flat. He was thinking of a dark sky and the shadows with drama, so he put on a red filter, the Raton 29 red filter, and that's very famous. And what the red filter does in black and white photography is it darkens blues. So the sky that was blue and the shadows that were blue changed the photograph, and this is the result. And he knew when he saw this, this was close to what he saw and he felt. This is the first time he had made it a way to make a mountain look like it feels, a monolithic, dramatic, monumental structure. And he famously said, when I'm ready to make a photograph, I quite obviously see in my mind's eye something that is not literally there in the true meaning of the word. I'm interested in something which is built up from within rather than extracted from without. And this was in the early 20th century when photography was dominated by what they called pictorialism. I talked about that in my last talk, a movement that sought to achieve fine art by manipulating the photographs with soft focus lenses, brushstrokes on negatives, textured papers to make them look more like paintings or drawings. And ironically, when he met Alfred Stieglitz, who I spoke about earlier in one of the talks I gave, was the master of pictorialism. But after this half-dome photograph, Ansel began to see photographic images differently. He saw them sharp, in focus, highly detailed. So in 1932, he and other masters, Edward Weston, Willard Van Dyke, and Imogen Cunningham, some of them are very famous, especially Imogen Cunningham, formed the now famous group F64. And this was the name derived from the smallest aperture or opening of the photographic lens on a big, large view camera with a big, large lens, creating the tack sharp images with high definition, which was an important element of this group. And these are some of the photographs that Ansel made from the group. And they displayed their sharp, focus, clear style of photography at San Francisco's de Young Museum in an exhibition that stands as a landmark in the history of the medium as another. But the photographs were met with icy condensation. I mean, pictorialism was the way of photography at that time, and they didn't like them. But the photographers became well known and highly influential in the new field. The departure of several members of the group from San Francisco led to the dissolution of the group by the end of 1935, but the new style of photography, this tack sharp images, this highly detailed images, stuck, and it took hold and began to grow. And by 1933, Ansel took his emerging portfolio to New York to meet that famous photographer, Alfred Stieglitz, one of the artists he most admired. And in his gallery on Madison Avenue, this is Stieglitz, the old master silently perused the Adams prints, not once, but twice, without uttering a word. Then he carefully closed and retied the portfolio with a bow. These are some of the finest photographs I have ever seen, he said. 3 years later, Stieglitz gave Adams a one-man show at an American Place, one of the most famous galleries in the country, a huge honor for Ansel. It meant that he was becoming a famous, great artist. And these are some of the photographs that were shown. Stieglitz was married to a person you've probably heard of named Georgia O'Keeffe, a great painter and a woman he befriended. And he took this picture, a famous picture of her in 1937 with the guide Orville Cox at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. This is a rare photograph with a 35 millimeter camera. Ansel didn't take many portraits, but in 1977, 40 years later, he made this striking portrait of her. Georgia O'Keeffe's artistic mastery and close relationship remained a major force in his life. But the increasing recognition of his work didn't alleviate his financial pressures in the 1930s, because in the 1930s, it was a debatable art form and people were not buying photographs, and his photographs at least. And in a letter dated August 6, 1935. He wrote to Edward Weston, seen here in Ansel's photograph of the photographer at Weston's place in Carmel. Been busy but broke. I can't seem to climb over the financial fence. Adams was compelled to spend much of his time as a commercial photographer to even survive. He worked at the National Park Service. He worked with Kodak and Zeiss and IBM, AT&T, a small women's college, a dried fruit company, and Life, Fortune, and Arizona Highways magazines. He became known as a highly skilled technician, and he served as a photographic consultant to Polaroid and to Hasselblad. But his commercial work was intermittent, and he constantly worried about paying the bills. And in fact, his financial situation would remain precarious until the 1970s, when he was nearing 70. But despite his constant insecurity, it's really, really quite remarkable that he remained dedicated to developing his artistic vision and technical mastery. He just never gave up. Between 1929 and 1945, Ansel Adams' work matured and he really became a lot more established. In particular, during the 1930s, his technical mastery of photography became legendary around the world, really, even during the Great Depression. More than any other creative photographer before or since, he defined the theory and practice of the medium. Edward Weston and Paul Strand, both photographic giants in the field, and work that Adams really admired, frequently consulted him for his technical advice. Really amazing. And he produced many books, 10 volumes of technical manuals on the subject. And his basic photo series, these 3 books seen here, became classics in photography and are still used today. And I can tell you, I've read every single one of these. And I was like absorbed in them because the advice was so wonderful and so perfect and really helped me. He wrote and contributed photographs to hundreds of articles and reviews from the 1930s until his death in 1984. And over the period of his life, he published over 10 major portfolios of photographic prints. And one notable thing that he did that a lot of photographers, if there are any out there that heard of the zone system, he formed that with a photographer, Fred Archer, in 1935. The photographer's zone system is a technique for translating light into specific densities or zones on negatives and prints. It gave photographers much more control over their finished photographs. And even today, with the big digital cameras that people use, they still use the zone system. That is the Bible, the zone system, and how it's used to control exposure. He also advocated the idea of visualization, whereby the final image is seen in the mind's eye before you take the photo. We saw that in the one image he took of a monolith, the Half Dome. He taught these and other techniques to thousands of amateur photographers through the publications of his workshops and his new group, the Friends of Photography, where I had the great, great honor of teaching in the 1980s down in Carmel. Adams' energy and capacity for work were just colossal. For the next 15 to 20 years, he labored sometimes 18 hours a day for days and weeks on ends. There were just no vacations or holidays or Sundays in Ansel's life. His images, besides being great pieces of art, became symbols and icons of wild America, and he began to deploy the photographs in the cause of wilderness preservation. Now, one thing he did in the 1940s, he built a big platform on a station wagon to afford him a better vantage point for his expansive wide views. And some of his challenging landscapes were made from this platform rather than the summits by needing to hike up and rugged hiking with heavy equipment in his earlier days. His photographs were inspired by the beauty of nature, but also the increasing desecration of the national parks, and in particular Yosemite, by commercial development. I think when people think about the national parks or the Sierra Club or even the environment itself, they envision an Ansel Adams photograph. He fought all the time for new parks and wilderness areas, for the National Wilderness Act, which was a big deal. He relentlessly pushed against overbuilt highways, all manner of environmental pollution, against billboards. I can't help thinking that Ansel would love Vermont because we have no billboards. He would have loved that. In 1938, a wealthy businessman named Walter Starr asked Ansel to take on a special project, which was a book of photographs for his young son, Peter, who died falling from the very mountains Ansel had been photographing for the environment. Ansel created the now famous limited edition book, Sierra Nevada, the John Muir Trail. And I've seen one of these. There was someone in Manchester who had one of these, and I looked through it. They're all original prints. Every single one of them has his original darkroom prints in it. It took him several years to make, and he only made 500. Stieglitz got a copy of it in New York, and he wrote to him and said, "You have literally taken my breath away. This book is perfect workmanship." And George O'Keeffe liked it and said, "It was like a trip to the high country again." The publication and this testimony before Congress helped designate the area as a national park in 1940 under Roosevelt, who liked the book so much he kept a copy for himself. For the first time, art and politics finally had come together in triumph. In 1941, Adams was invited by the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, to photograph the national parks and to create large-scale mural prints for the new Washington, D.C. Interior Building. Adams received a Guggenheim Fellowship to allow this work, creating a book, a portfolio, and many, many huge, you're talking about the size of a gigantic wall in a building, a body of work that remains and is still admired today in many places. But his photographs stood as artwork on their own, and many of his greatest images were made in the 1930s and the 1940s. Then, in 1941, when he was 39 years old, Ansel Adams created an image that is legendary and literally altered his life and fortune forever. And it was unplanned. In November that year, Ansel had been driving through the northern New Mexico, near the town of Taos after a long photographic assignment for the Department of the Interior. And he comes upon a tiny village of Hernandez, a little tiny village in New Mexico in the last light of day, just after the sunset. And he looks out the window and he sees this scene. There were these tiny pueblos and a church with gold crosses in its cemetery, brightly illuminating in the setting sun. This long, dark field leading up to distant snow-capped mountains rimmed with bright clouds and a glowing moon floating alone in the sky. Don't worry, I'm going to show it to you. Ansel said, "We were sailing southward on the highway, not far from Espanola, when I looked to the left and I noticed an inevitable photograph, and I almost ditched a car and I rushed to set up my 8x10 view camera. I was yelling to my companions to bring me things from the car. One of them was his 10-year-old son, Michael. I had a clear visualization of the image I wanted, but when the Ratten number 15 filter and the film holder were in place and I was all ready, I couldn't find my exposure meter. The situation was desperate. The low setting sun was trailing the edge of the clouds of the west, and the shadow would soon dim the white crosses. I was at a loss with the subject's values, and I suddenly remembered the luminescence of the moon. It was 250 candles per square foot. And I rapidly calculated the shot, realizing as I released the shutter that I had an unusual photograph which deserved a duplicate negative. I swiftly reversed the film holder, and as I pulled the dark side of the film holder, I realized that the sunlight had passed from the white crosses. I was seconds too late. Ansel liked to call this chance favors the prepared mind, that he was ready, even though he didn't have the light meter. He was able to get that scene on film, one shot. He had plans for how he would handle such a stroke of luck. I mean, literally in 10 seconds, that life went off the crosses and there was only one exposure. He was very, very close to missing the image, and it is a testament to his skills. And here is what Ansel Adams saw in his darkroom. This is an 8x10 unmanipulated contact print that first recorded that image in November of 1941. The moon was dim, the sky was gray. There was lots of dust on the negative. The foreground was gray and the crosses were not distinguished at all. It was actually underexposed in the foreground. The effect basic was flat and unflattering to what he had seen at the time. What he had seen was dramatic, with bright crosses and bright mountains and clouds and a lone moon hanging in the sky. So he began to print it with increasing complicated burning and dodging techniques. And this was the result. He knew this was an important image, one that would become a great image, but he was never completely satisfied with the prints he made early on. And so he worked with him over the next 40 years in the darkroom. And over the years, the increasing drama over time. In the 1941 image, you can still see the wisps of the clouds in the sky. But by 1970s, it was much more dramatic with a dark sky. And he particularly liked that dark one. I personally like the early one, but he didn't make many of them. So this is one of the earlier versions and toned in selenium, which gives it a warm look. And one fascinating thing about this photograph that is really important and not many people know about it is its date. Adams had contacted with the Department of the Interior to make photographs of the national parks to use as mural-sized prints for the department's new building. The government agreed that Ansel would make photographs for his own use. Although Adams kept meticulous records of his photographic details, exposure, and so forth, he was undisciplined about the dates. And he neglected to note the date of this photograph. He thought it was about October 31st, 1941, so it wasn't clear whether it belonged to Adams or the US government. The position of the moon and the spot that they located, several astronomers determined that moonrise was made at 4:49 p.m. on November 1st, 1941. It was a day for which he had not billed the government. The negative belonged to Ansel. This is so significant because the value of this photograph brought him millions. So here he is in a wonderful portrait by Martha Cassanavi, which I'll talk about in a minute. For nearly 40 years, Ansel reinterpreted the moonrise image using more sophisticated darkroom equipment. And he made over 1,300 unique prints, mostly in 16 by 20 format, which you see here. The prints later became larger, moving up to 60 by 40 by 60, which is like 3.5 by 5 feet. They were made in the 1970s, most of them, and provided him a total financial independence from his commercial projects. An original 16 by 20 gelatin silver print sold for $500 during his lifetime, but rose rapidly after his death. And somebody actually offered for me to buy one at $500, but back then I couldn't afford it. And I'm so sad that I didn't get one, because in 2006, 22 years after his death, a single signed 1948 print of Moonrise was sold for $609,600 in a Sotheby's auction. And just last year, Sotheby's offered a one-of-a-kind original 1941, very rare and less dramatic print of Moonrise that sold for $685,000. The Sotheby's representative said it's rare not to see a moonrise or two in an auction, but still they're just never enough to meet the demand. It's so popular. And the total value of the moonrise prints is estimated to exceed today over $25 million. And I don't want to suggest that the amount of money that Ansel made or the amount of money that were paid for his photographs made them great. They made them great because of his artistry and his mastery in the darkroom and his vision. And people loved his images. They just couldn't get enough of them. So as Ansel's work matured, his photographs became more dramatic. At first, in the 1930s and 20s, you had these high horizons and you're sort of locked out. And then when he gets into the 30s and 40s, he drops that horizon and suddenly you've got these limitless spaces. It's an incredible feeling of openness. And that's, I think, when he's at his best, when you just sort of lose yourself, you know, that beautiful sky that Ansel created. So there are several photographs that Ansel used to teach his students and are good illustrations of his ability and quite famous. And I'll tell you about 4 famous photographs that I learned about from him and his assistants when I was in Carmel. The first is called Clearing Winter Storm. It's an absolutely gorgeous photograph. This was taken in early December 1940 and was during a huge winter storm with rapidly changing scenes, requiring him to race up to Inspiration Point, which is where this is, and to make rapid decisions. The moving clouds meant he needed a short exposure and a small lens opening to increase the sharpness, put on a yellow filter, and to improve the contrast, but it was raining and the lens cap had to be kept on for the immediately before exposure. It was very technically difficult. It was very low contrast with few details, but he clearly visualized the picture as a dramatic storm that was beginning to clear, and he took care in the relative brightness of the various aspects of the photograph, particularly that gorgeous waterfall that you see over to the right. He gave the negative a lengthened development that gave it otherwise low contrast scene a lot more contrast. In printing the negative and printing the image proved very, very difficult with different papers and formulas tried. And it took him over a year before he produced one print that he liked. In 2010, a mural-sized print of this image sold at Sotheby's for $722,500, which is the highest price ever paid for an Ansel Adams photograph. The next image is called Mount Williamson, early Eastern Sierra, 1944. This is the eastern side of the Sierras, and he, in a lecture, told us that, he said it seldom rains in the Owens Valley here, but when it does, huge clouds and curtains of rain over the mountain summits are really spectacular. When the clouds and storms appear, the cloud shadows and the mountains bring everything to life, and shapes and planes appear that we didn't see before. And so he waited and waited for this to look like this. By photographing from the vantage point of the platform of his car, he was able to focus his 8x10 view camera on the vast field of boulders that extends to its base, as well as in the 14,000-foot mountain. His photograph of Mount Williamson is actually ripe with the mystical and holy presence of that Ansel believed permeated the area surrounding this area, the area called Manzanar. Because during World War II, Ansel took photographs that documented the Japanese Americans imprisoned at the Manzanar Relocation Center in California in 1944. His images and text were published by U.S. Camera in a 112-page book called Born Free and Equal. Ansel believed this scene would have been the point at which the prisoners would have been looking out of their cells and looking at from their camp towards Mount Williamson. Conceptually, he thought of the stones would represent the prisoner looking up at the distant mountain for justice and freedom. He was really, truly in tune with the environment and the people of the area, and he just thought that the whole imprisonment of Japanese Americans was horrible. Along the eastern side of the Sierras is a 100-mile wall of mountains. I mean, I've seen it. It's just dramatic. It rises up off the valley floor dramatically. And in the little town of Lone Pine in the Owens Valley is a land of desolate beauty. And on one winter morning, early winter morning, in a ride with Virginia in 1944, Ansel encountered a beautiful scene. He said, "I saw this scene, a bright, glistening sunrise with light clouds streaming from the southwest and casting swift shadows on this meadow and dark rolling hills." And he set up his 8x10 view camera. It was very cold, near zero. And at the last possible moment, there was a horse in the foreground that had been facing away and turned to offer his profile with this result. And I personally, this is my favorite photograph. It is absolutely gorgeous. It illustrates Ansel Adams' attention to the control of natural light, and it shows a full spectrum of values and highlights in his darkroom work. It was very difficult to make this print. The white jagged lines of the mountains stand out against the soft gray of the sky, and that had to be balanced. And then the foothills are blanketed by a dark shadow that Adams manipulated to remove any details. In fact, some high school students carved LP for Lone Pine in the hills in the foreground, and he blanked that out. Behind the horse, the glistening highlights of rows of leafless trees. It's all accentuated with the drama of the sunlight on the snowy cliffs. And that spot of sunlight coming down in the foreground with a horse in it just accentuates that feeling of space and a tremendous feeling of distance. There have been 2 recorded sales at auction of this image, 3.5 feet One in 2010 sold for $482,500, and 4 years later, a print slightly smaller sold for more, for $585,000. It was very important for Ansel to convey his inner feelings about his photographs, about his subject, and he put the negative in the enlarger. And every printing experience was essentially a new rebirth of the image. As a composer, he often said, my negative is the composer's score and the print is the performance of that score. So sometimes he printed things very somberly, dark. Sometimes he would print things light and airy, but every time he tried to be faithful to how he felt and what he saw in the scene. This is him actually doing a dodging this tape on the edge of a piece of cardboard, blocking out some of the light of the next photograph I'm going to show you, which is called the Snake River Grand Tetons. This was taken in 1942 in Northwest Wyoming's Grand Teton National Park, and it showcases the beauty of the Teton Range and the Snake River before it, and highlights the mastery in composition in his darkroom work. This photograph actually shaped the way Americans thought of the American wilderness, and it was one of several, very few photographs used in Congress to protect our parks. The Tetons and Snakes Rivers have been used for the mural project and became the property of the US government, but that later transferred back to the Adams estate. And in 2009, a 16 by 20 print sold of this for $450,000. This is amazing. It's in 1977. NASA launched the Voyager spacecraft to explore Jupiter and Saturn and beyond. This photograph was one of a chosen of a collection to fly on this mission to convey life on Earth and the planet itself. Today, Voyager is still going, and it's 12 billion miles into deep space in our solar system, still transmitting data back, still with Ansel Adams' photograph. A great tribute to him. This is Adams at the Art Institute in San Francisco that he founded in 1945. He invited Dorothea Lange, I'm sure you've all heard of her, Imogene Cunningham, and Edward Weston to be guest lecturers. Minor White was the lead instructor. In fact, 1952, Adams was one of the founders of the magazine Aperture, which was a big deal back then. I still have copies of that, which is intended as a serious journal of photography showcasing his newest innovations. He began teaching in 1955 in annual workshops, first alone and then through the Friends of Photography, teaching many students until 1981. Here, he is teaching Susan Ford, the daughter of Gerald and Betty Ford, and he continued with commercial assignments for another 20 years and became a consultant for Polaroid Corporation, which was founded by his friend Edward Land, who made then later a massive Polaroid camera, the 20 by 24 Land Polaroid camera. And in 1979, Ansel was commissioned by the White House to photograph Jimmy Carter with this large 20 by 24 Land Polaroid camera, which was the first presidential portrait that was not a painting. It looked like a painting, but it wasn't. It was a beautiful photograph. And he became very, very good friends with the Carters. This helped bolster the environmental protections, particularly in Alaska, that they had control over. This lovely photograph is by Martha Cassanavi, which I'll talk about in a minute. During his career, Ansel was the recipient of several Guggenheim Fellowships, which was his photographs of every national park. He was awarded 3 honorary doctorates at Harvard and Yale, elected fellow of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1966, and then in 2007, 22 years after his death. And in 1974, he had a major retrospective exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in the year he died, he was elected into the International Photography Hall of Fame. This work fostered the close relationships of Adams' life with Beaumont Newhall, who was a very famous at the time historian and museum administrator. And this was a stroke of great luck. Here we see Ansel and Beaumont in Ansel's home. This is a Martha Cassanavi print that I bought. And I was incredibly lucky to find both men at a birthday party for Ansel, and they signed it. So this is my signed image of Beaumont and Ansel taken in Ansel's home. Their partnership was really a significant collaboration in 20th century photography because Beaumont and his wife Nancy, with Ansel, created many books and exhibitions of historical significance, particularly the one famous that you probably have heard of called This is the American Earth, 1960. This was won the national attention and was hailed by Supreme Court Justice Douglas as one of the greatest statements in the history of conservation. During the 1970s, most of his time was spent curating and printing negatives from his vault, in part to satisfy the great demand of art museums, which he had finally created in the departments of photography and desired his iconic works. That year also, he co-founded the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, which handles some of his estate matters, and I'll show you in a minute. One of my photographs of him went there. Now, Ansel Adams was truly, truly famous, and he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, the only photographer to have ever appeared there. But later in his life, he felt guilty about not photographing. He was in his 60s, and he said, you know, I just got to get out there and photograph. You could tell that he felt that they were going to take his union card away, but he just didn't do it. Yet his remarkable vision was always intact, especially if you look at his later images. He made one called Half Dome, Moon in Half Dome, and the other El Capitan, Winter Sunrise. Those are two of his probably 12 best pictures, and he made them on the spur of the moment. So he still had it. So in December 1960, during a stop while driving towards Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite, he saw the moon rising above Half Dome, the same mountain he had photographed 33 years later in 1927, earlier. He watched as the shadows of the setting sun were creeping along the dome's 2,000-foot cliff, and he just felt this could not be missed, and he got his Hasselblad out and he photographed it. And he said, you know, it's beautiful, but it's never the same. Half Dome is never the same light, never the same mood. It always looks different. And here is really, truly one of the most beautiful photographs called El Capitan Winter Sunrise, 1968. Here he used a Polaroid negative. He came upon this morning scene and he positioned himself in one of the classic viewpoints where we could see the 3,000-foot cliff. He visualized the glow of the sun on the icy cliff to stress the contrast and the shadows in the foreground around it. There was this high altitude haze and things kept moving around, and he had a really difficult time getting it on film, and he tried capturing it, the swirling clouds, and he made 6 shots, and this one was the one, and really brilliant. If I ever saw this in person, it's just colossal. This is a lovely portrait of Ansel taken by the great photographer Karsh, Joseph Karsh. When he was nearing 70, the financial security that eluded him all of his life materialized at last. And it was in the form of an enterprising student in forestry, of all things, named William Turnage, who Ansel met in the spring of 1970. And Turnage took over the management of his affairs, swiftly turning the Adams archive into a multi-million-dollar business, and Adams himself into a popular national icon and the first mass-marketed fine arts photographer of the world. I can tell you that Adams didn't really like that idea of that, but he really wanted, you know, he needed money, and this was one way to get it. Here, Ansel and Bill Turnage on the right met with President Gerald and Betty Ford, and he presented them with Clearing Winter Storm that I showed you, and he urged them, now, Mr. President, every time you look up on at this picture on the wall, I want you to remember your obligation to the national parks. He spent the last 2 decades of his life in a very productive way, making prints that he had been unable to print, and was racing around doing jobs, and he created a whole series of books of new work. He was most influential at this time of his life from the environment, and he was only one American, really, who could just pick up the phone and call a president and meet with him. He was in the darkroom every day, out lecturing, out around in the country, talking about photography, even when he was 80. He was working 12 or more hours a day, 7 days a week, traveling constantly, very, very productive. I mean, he operated at full steam for 20 years, which is very good for any artist. Year after year, the honors and the accolades poured in. And in the fall of '79, he was honored with a significant large retrospective exhibit at the Metropolitan at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which drew national, actually world attention, further fame. And then just a year later, at a gallery ceremony at the White House, he was presented by Jimmy Carter the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Carter said, "At one with the power of the American landscape and renowned for his patient skill and timeless beauty of his work, Ansel Adams has been a visionary in his efforts to preserve the country's wild and scenic places, both on film and on earth." It is really through his fortune and fortitude that so much of America has been saved for future generations, for future Americans. And it was at this time that I first met Ansel, unfortunately later in his life, through the photographer mentor who you see here, Martha Casanabi, who introduced me to him and Carmel. Here's their portrait of them. I thought it was funny because Ansel's hat hid the long shutter release cord of the large view camera that was facing them. And this is one of her most beautiful photographs of him at his piano, one I own, I cherish. She had photographed him every year, and on one portrait session of Ansel in Virginia, I had been invited to meet him. And as I was standing around, she turned to me and said, "Okay, Chris, get in the picture, sit down next to Ansel." And I was shocked. So I very reluctantly sat next to him, and he took off his glasses and looked at me. And this was the photograph she took of me and him. It's hard to believe I still have this. And I mean, I still believe that happened. I spent the next 2 years working with him and his assistants at his home in Carmel, California, in his darkroom. And I'd already read his books and studied his technique. And I studied with some of his photographic peers, notably Alan Ross, who is a famous photographer now, and John Sexton, who some of you photographers may know. And he's a really fantastic, he was one of last Ansel's assistants, and then Chris Rainier, who was the last one. Here's Ansel's portrait by Martha. And he always thought that his work, he said, "I hope my work will encourage self-expression in others and stimulate this beauty and creative excitement of the world around us." He was really a generous man in teaching us techniques, and he wondered whether new methods would allow photographers to express themselves in other creative ways. They in 1988 made a digital camera, and then in the early 90s, the first commercial, like 1 megapixel, as opposed to today's Canon or Nikon cameras recording 50 megapixels, and iPhones capturing 15 megapixels, amazing. But if you were to take an Ansel Adams 8x10 negative, which you see here, and scan it at high resolution, it would yield an equivalent of almost 2,000 megapixels. And that is one reason why his images, even large images, are unbelievably sharp and amazingly detailed. And my photography was really heavily influenced by the man. Here I attempted with a medium format camera early on a print of Yosemite. I can't believe I had the guts to actually photograph Yosemite and bring it to Ansel Adams, but I did. And Virginia looked at the print and said, "Oh, look, Ansel, this is our old backyard." But Ansel wasn't so kind with his remarks, and he walked over to look at the print, and he picked it up. It was 11x14 mounted on a white backboard, and he looked at it closely, holding it up to the light of the window. He considered it for a while. Then he put it down, took off his glasses, and looked at me. I'll never forget that look. And he said, "Well, do you want me to just give it to you straight or just be polite?" I said, "Give it to me straight." And for some reason, I just felt comfortable with him, and I knew that he would help me immensely. And that began an intense period of study with him and mostly his assistants, and some of the prints later worthy of shows. And I'll just show you a couple here. This is Baker Beach in San Francisco. Mono Lake at dawn, highly influenced by Ansel. Half Dome, obviously, very influenced by Ansel. And this is one of my favorites. Monterey Fog and White Calla Lilies, and then Monterey Yosemite Moon, taken from the same vantage point as Clearing Winter Storm, obviously influenced by him. But this is my most proud possession. This is a portrait I took of him the year before he passed. And I made it at his 81st birthday party in Carmel, and I had just run out of black and white film. I was so bummed out. I had no black and white film left. Of course, at that time, I didn't realize, well, later we'll be able to scan it and turn it into a black and white. But I put it in and I set up the camera, and he saw me pointing it at him, and he was very happy. He knew I was photographing him, and he just stood, he folded his hands and stood proudly in this contemplative stance while his wife Virginia in the background grinned at me. So I got this one image, and I had Kodak print it in Palo Alto, and I drove to Ansel's house in Carmel and showed the print to him. It was a beautiful print. And he really loved the photograph, and he wanted more to be made, some to give to his children. And this image was accepted into the archives last summer of the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, the institution that would house his prints and negatives. That was a major honor for me. And I still have the original print, which is seen here, which is signed by him. I wanted to spend more time, getting to know him and finding out more about him and teaching. But on the evening of April 22nd in 1984, I learned that his heart had given out. He had died then, and he was surrounded by his family. He maintained his brilliance, his vigor, and humor. I heard great stories about him, cracking jokes in the hospital room. He was 82, survived by his wife, Virginia, and his two children, Anne and Michael. And 6 months after his death, in an extraordinary tribute to the man, and the great photographer and environmentalist, Congress set aside an immense tract of 232,000 acres of wild land in Yosemite and named it Ansel Adams Wilderness. And just a year later, in a remote sun-swept peak at the very top of the High Sierra, where you see in the right here, this photograph was named Mount Ansel Adams, and it would be a place where his ashes would be scattered. It was a place that he absolutely loved. And it was a fitting tribute to him and a place of pilgrimage for conservationists. It still is today. And photography lovers are inspired by him. And ironically, this is his photograph of that very place taken when he was a young man in 1943. His subject matter, the magnificent beauty of the West, really was unmistakably American. And his chosen instrument, the camera, was a popular artifact of the 20th century culture. He was blessed really with a generous and charismatic personality, and he had great faith in people and human nature. Above all, Adams' philosophy and optimism struck a chord with America, and his work continues to be admired throughout the world. I mean, the love that Americans poured out for this man during his life, and that was continued with undiminished enthusiasm after his death, is really an extraordinary phenomenon, unparalleled in our country's response to a visual artist. So I wondered how best to conclude this talk. I mean, I think to honor such a great photographer and musician, and to showcase his great talents, I would display some of his really beautiful photographs to the Bach Air, a piano piece that he particularly loved to play. So please enjoy. Here we go. And I end with this portrait of Ansel, one of the famous ones, as he stands outside his darkroom in Carmel. It's really unlikely that the photographer has ever brought a wild landscape the passion and trust and belief that he brought to it. And thus his pictures are really all the more precious, for they stand as the last records for the young and for the future, for what they've missed and for the aging. For a little while, there'll be a souvenir was lost. And if you look at Ansel's photographs, you wouldn't know that Frontier had closed. You'll still think that America was still that wild place. He captured on beauty, they captured that beauty on film, the wilderness, the untouched places. And for that, Ansel has given and will continue to give us his wonderful treasures forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Every time I see this, I'm just overwhelmed by the stunning photographs and the legacy that he has left behind. It's truly an amazing presentation. So thank you. I have a comment. Thank you for a fantastic lecture, just wonderful. And a question. Could you tell us about the comments that Ansel Adams made about the Yosemite image that you showed to him?
When I showed him that image of Yosemite, I couldn't believe I had the guts to do that. You know, he didn't really remark about the actual image. He was more concerned with the values of the photograph, and he felt that I could really do a lot more with it. And he started showing me, walking me into the darkroom and actually showing me how I can improve that image. And I actually did later on. I made a better print of it. I showed it to him, but he wasn't particularly, he didn't say anything particularly bad about, you know, this is a bad vantage point or it's not good composition or anything. It was more about the quality of the image.
I have a comment from Nicole who says, thank you so much. The kids and I enjoyed this very much. So nice to be able to introduce them to Ansel's work, which I think is fascinating that we had some young kids here with us to see this.
I used to live in San Francisco before I moved to Vermont in 1983, and I worked at a hospital where he had his heart surgery. And I was the eye photographer there. And I actually went up onto the ward and met him by walking up and down the hall. And they made him get up and exercise after his heart surgery. He'd had heart surgery in 82, and he died of a heart attack in April of 84. So I had a 5-minute conversation with him. And didn't really bring up photography. It's pretty hard to talk to a heart patient and say, let's forget all that and we'll just talk about it. But it was a singular honor to meet an idol, even in that circumstance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He was, as I said, you know, attained his humor right up until the end. Actually, one of his assistants, John Sexton, was in the room with him, I think, at one point, and he said, that Ansel told the doctor, listen, I want you to do blood work on me when I'm gone, and I need you to analyze my blood to make sure I don't have any strange chemicals from all the chemicals that I've handled over the years. I want to know if it had any effect. He said, well, I can do that. And he said, where would you like me to send the results? And he just pointed up. Vladimir Ashkenazy, the great Russian pianist, played in his home for friends of his who were gathered, and they knew he was dying, and it was a just an amazing tribute to him. They played some of his favorite music.
We have a question from Anne who asks, what do you think he would think of the iPhone photos of today?
I always think about that because I take a lot of them. I feel guilty doing that. Oh, I think he would be fascinated by them. He was always really interested in what new technologies could bring for photography. And of course, back then he had no idea what they could do. Oh, I'm sure he would just be absolutely amazed. Although I think that he would realize that people are just not paying attention to, I mean, when Ansel photographed something, it took him hours to compose, and people just hold their phone up and take a picture. I try very carefully to compose the photograph just in reverence to him, but I think he would have loved it, and I think he would have just thought it had amazing what we can do with iPhones and even digital cameras. I mean, really, truly beautiful stuff.
We have a comment from Vanita. She says, extremely informative and interesting perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing such lovely stories and amazing images.
Well, that's Vanita and Lalit in California, and they're the ones that live in the Bay Area. So they heard those. They could relate to the stories of Yosemite and the Merced Valley and the De Young Museum and all those places that Ansel trotted over those years. Yes. Thank you, Vanita.
You can still go to Yosemite. It's still open. It's still there. I was there in October 2010. We did a course there and had a tour and a reception in there's an entire building dedicated to him, and the darkroom you saw in the pictures still is operational.
Well, Ansel Gallery, you're talking about the Ansel Adams Gallery?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a great place.
And Yosemite has made it, you can't run photography workshops in Yosemite Valley except through Ansel Adams workshops.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I know several people who do that. I mean, I know Alan Ross does that. I don't know if John Sexton still does, but Charles Kramer and some others, you know, greats that go up there. Yeah. Oh, I mean, I remember putting my tripod down in almost in the exact place that Ansel, trying to photograph something, and there would be people stopping at the side of the road with that big view camera, and they'd get out of the car and they'd start taking pictures. They had no idea what I was looking at in the ground glass of my view camera. So I thought it was rather humorous. But yes, it's a wonderful place for photography. Unfortunately, being overrun, and it's awfully crowded. In fact, I just read in the Wall Street Journal that some of the parks are closing their doors temporarily because of COVID, scares. So I don't know in California whether I know that they're opening. So we'll see if that's the case in Yosemite.
I think if you want to go into Yosemite today, you have to have a reservation just to get in the property.
Right.
Our son and grandson are hikers out there and enjoyed it very much. And they had to make special arrangements to go there in recent time.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
it was closed for an entire year.
Really?
You couldn't go in. And they said at the beginning of winter this year, or the end of winter, it was as close to what it was like when he was there as it has been since 1940, I guess, because no one was in there. And the animals all came back in the valley.
Yeah, a lot of places that happened. Yeah, I'm sure that they were just having a ball over there. All those deer and whatever. Yeah. The great place. I haven't really ever been to Yosemite for a long time. The last time I was there with my wife, we went up there, and I went up there with my view camera, and there was a big fire in a nearby county, and it was just smoke everywhere. It was horrible. So it wasn't a good experience, but I've spent many times there, and it's always a terrific place. And I always love the Iowani Hotel. It's such a great place.
I think it had a big fire.
There's no way you could turn off messages like it. There's Harold.
I just want to thank you again, Chris, for a really, really wonderful presentation. The photographs you shared are just amazing. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here for this presentation. So thank you again. And I hope to see you at our next lecture. Have a great evening.